Hi and welcome to my channel. My name is Beth and I am the Bookworm Trait. And today we are going to talk about every single book that I DNF'd in 2020. Actually, that's not quite correct. We're going to talk about every book I can remember DNFing or I actually recorded DNFing. There are 15 books on this list, but I am sure I DNF'd a lot more than that. I would count myself as a little bit of a proclaimed queen of DNFing. I have no qualms about it. If I am not enjoying that book, I am not going to force myself to read it. I definitely haven't always been this kind of reader, but since DNFing, my reading has just improved tenfold. My enjoyment of reading has improved tenfold. And I find that I generally end up with higher average ratings for the year because I'm enjoying a lot more of what I'm actually reading. There are also more books that I DNF'd and then went back to and read. Some of these ended up being some of my favourite books of the year. So Crescent City, I DNF'd and I ended up giving it 5 stars. Others, I didn't like that much anyway. So The Binding, I DNF'd it. When I went back to it, I ended up giving it 3 stars. Like, it was okay, but I see why I DNF'd it and I probably should have just left it where it was. In typical Beth fashion, I have not prepared for this video and I'm looking at some of the books on this list and I can't remember them. So this is going to be an interesting video. The first book on this list is a book called Born Darkly. And if I remember correctly, I picked this book up for Smutathon back in January. So a year ago. I believe this was a dark romance, like a mafia romance, is that what they're called? I don't know, they're not really my kind of book. I just don't really have a great deal of interest in the criminal underworld. Apart from the Wicked Villains series by Katie Roberts, if you know me, you know that's one of my favourite romance series. But this just, I mean, it's not stuck with me. Luckily for this one, I have written some notes in my spreadsheet that I was using to track my reading last year. I haven't done this for like any of the others. So for this, I've just written, this was so boring. I felt no connection to the characters and I didn't feel any spark between them. So we're off to a good start with this because that's literally all I have to say about this because I don't remember anything about it. The second book on this list is The Beholder. This is a I'm going to say this is a YA fantasy. It wasn't very fantastical. This was about a girl from somewhere in New England. I want to say Potomac, but I don't know if that's because I've been watching The Real Housewives of Potomac. If you're a Real Housewives fan and you're not watching that, what are you doing with your life? The heroine of this story is the daughter of the leader of the settlement that she lives in. And she is like the heir. So she is set to take over when her father dies. Part of being an heir means that she has to be married. And she proposes to a guy who she's very good friends with, who she thinks is going to be a really good husband, and she's sure that he is going to say yes and that he has feelings for her as she does for him. But he rejects her and she ends up going on this tour of Europe to try and find a husband. Now, if you think this book doesn't sound that interesting, you would be correct. There is something about the premise of this that is intriguing to me. I really enjoy books with an ocean setting, and this is like this great voyage across Europe. I also love books that are set in Europe, being a European. But honestly, this was boring. This was so boring. I could probably tell you what all of the twists were about in this book, despite the fact that I don't think I made it half the way through. I think this is maybe a book that if I had read it when I was 14, I would have thought it was okay. But reading it as a grown-ass woman, I was like, this is really fucking stupid. The next book on this list is Beauty Queens, and I remember who this one is by, Libba Bray. Before I start talking about the Beauty Queens, I want to talk about Libba Bray's other book series, The Diviners, because that was a book that I very, very nearly DNF'd the whole way through it, and I persevered and I finished it, and I think I gave it 3 stars. and there were things that I really liked about it, but overall I just didn't really like it that much. I felt exactly the same about Beauty Queens, and I think maybe she's just not an author for me. So Beauty Queens is about a group of beauty queens. They are on a plane headed to some kind of beauty queen thing. Pageant? Maybe they're just headed to a pageant, like that would make sense. Their plane crashes and they end up stranded on a desert island. Well, not a desert island, a deserted island. And this book is basically Lord of the Flies with women and an evil corporation. And honestly, I think this is a good book. I think the premise is super intriguing. I was enjoying it, but I didn't finish it. And that is something that happens to me sometimes. And I'm sure this is not going to be the first book that I talk about with this specific issue on this list, because I will read a book and be like, yeah, it's all right. And then I just don't have the motivation to read it. This was what happened with Beauty Queens. And I just think this was not a book for me, whether it be because it was YA and that's a genre that I've really fallen out of love with recently, whether it be that the premise just wasn't interesting enough for me, don't think it was that, or whether it be that it just wasn't a very good book. I don't know. If you think this book sounds interesting, please go and read it. Let me know if it's actually good. But also be aware that there is a TV show which is basically this book, but they've changed like just enough so they don't have to give credit to Libra Bray, which I think is kind of shady. But honestly, the TV show is so good. I absolutely binged it. Everybody I've recommended it to absolutely binged it and loved it. And it's called The Wilds, and I think it's on Amazon Prime, at least it is in the UK. And it's so good. So go and watch that. Read the book if you want. Let me know what you thought. The next book on this list is Blood Heir. Don't know who this one is by. Another book I don't really remember. This book was kind of doing the rounds on BookTube and I kind of got taken into the hype. I have a monthly buddy read and this was the book that we decided to read this month, that month. What month was it? May. I don't really remember anything about this book. I believe it's an Anastasia retelling, but I was not getting Anastasia vibes from it. All I can remember is I almost immediately didn't like this book. I was listening to the audiobook of it and I think I managed to do like 3 days worth of pages. So that was probably around 150 pages that I managed to get through this book, and I was like, do you know what, I don't want to read this anymore. I am not enjoying it. I can't remember what the rest of the group thought, but if I'm honest, I don't think this is a book that you should really bother with. Since the initial hype of this book's release, I haven't really heard anything good about it. I've heard some people who didn't like it and I heard some people who were kind of like indifferent towards it, but I've not heard anyone who was like, oh my god, this book was so good. So unless you're like super intrigued, I would just say just watch Anastasia the film and move on with your life. Those are my wise words of advice. The next book on this list is another book that we read in our buddy read, and that was The Near Witch by V.E. Schwab. I think I made it about halfway through this one, and I think I kind of hit a slump and decided I'm going to put it down and come back to it a little bit later on, but I never came back to it. And there is a reason for that. I kind of like wasn't super in love with this book anyway. I know this is V.E. Schwab's first book, so it had that first book vibe about it. Obviously, writing is like any skill, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. And often you find that if you read a lot of books from an author and then you go back and read their like first book, it's not working. You come to equate that author with having a certain skill level and a certain way of writing that they might not have in their earlier books. I didn't think this book was bad, I just didn't care for it. I just had no interest in it. When I realised I'd forgotten to go back and pick it up, I checked in with the group and I was like, guys, I forgot to pick this up, how was it? And everyone was just like, it was okay. And that was kind of the overall feeling that I got for the book anyway, so I was just like, fine, if it's just okay, I'm just okay not to read it. So most of the books that I've talked about so far have been books that I'm just kind of like I'm indifferent towards them. That's usually the case with books that I DNF because I don't read enough of them to hate them. I'm just not feeling gripped. So I think, let's put this down and come back to it later if we so choose to. The next book is a book that I did not like. I read this book in July for the reading rush. So if you watch my reading rush vlogs, you might know what this is. This was Tangleweed and Brian, which is a collection of feminist retellings of fairy tales, which just, that's me, that's my vibe. No, apparently it is not. I was reading like 1 or 2 of these a day, and I don't really remember how far I got through this book, but I did not like it. I hated the writing style in it. I found that the overall message wasn't particularly empowering. If I remember correctly, which I may not, there was kind of like not like other girl vibes to some of it, and that's not the kind of feminism that I'm here for. We embrace all types of women as feminists, not just what we perceive to be an ideal girl. Like, no. The whole thing just felt very pretentious, very overdone. It felt like it was talking down to you. Whatever the message was just hidden under layers of subtext. Like, it just wasn't a fun time. Like, I am not reading for critical analysis here. If I choose to read to do some critical analysis, it's not going to be Tangleweed and Brian. It's going to be something good. I'm sorry. That's just how we feel about this one. So the next book is a book that I was really sad that I just wasn't feeling, and that was Wicked As You Wish. This was a book that I had received in some kind of subscription box, probably Fairy Loot, and it was set in a world where fairy tales were real, but they were from like a parallel universe that had this like catastrophic event, and then the people from the fairy tales had come across to our world as like refugees. And it was like, the premise of this book was so intriguing to me. It was kind of like a King Arthur retelling, but with like lots of other characters. So I think the Snow Queen was in there. That's the only one I can remember off the top of my head. What do we say about this one? This book is a good book, but this is definitely on the younger end of YA, and therefore it just wasn't really hitting the notes that I wanted it to hit. That's obviously not a criticism of the book. It's YA. It can be aimed at 13-year-olds, it can be aimed at 17-year-olds. Either way, I am not the target audience, so I cannot say that it's too young. It's just that for me, it was not as captivating because I think this was written towards more of like the 12 to 14 age group, and we just weren't vibing. If I'd read this as like a 16-year-old, I would have loved it. I would have thought it was so good. If you're someone who can quite happily enjoy books aimed at a younger audience, then by all means I would recommend picking this up, because I just thought it was so cool. Like, the world building was really cool, and I really liked the characters. I just couldn't like connect with the story. But if that's not an issue for you, then definitely pick this up because it was good. And I don't hear people talking about this book ever. The next book is another one that I hated, and this was actually a 5-star prediction. Can you believe? I thought I would love this book, and I hated it. I hated it. I despised it. Thinking about this book makes me kind of angry because it was expensive. This book was All What You Will by an award-winning author, Jo Walton. I hated this book. There's just no getting around it. This book is advertised as a fantasy book about an author who is coming to the end of her life, and she has one kind of like special character who has appeared in all of her books under different guises. This character is aware that the author is going to die, and therefore he will die with her, and so he begins to come up with ways that they can kind of survive after death. Now that sounds really interesting, except that is not what the book is about. The book is more a deep delve into the writing process and how world building and character creation come about, but with a strong emphasis on the historical and real world aspects that are behind those. So it's more like a memoir. It's like reading a memoir of a very established and intelligent person who has written this great world, and they're telling you how they came up with this, but they're a lot more intelligent than you, me, and you don't really understand what they're talking about. That's a more accurate description of this book. Do I think I'm too dumb for this book? Yes, I do. Is that the author's fault? No, it's not. However, this book was incorrectly marketed. If the description of this book was actually what this book was about, I would never have picked this up. I would never have spent all that freaking money on it, and I wouldn't be left with this bitter sour taste in my mouth when I think about Or What You Will. One of my most anticipated books of the year. The next book that I DNF'd is Blood Orange, and I DNF'd this book after a grand total of 10 pages. I was reading this book at the same time as the next book on my DNF list, so I'm going to talk about them together. So the next book was Final Girls, which is by Riley Sager, I think. And both of these books are thrillers. As I said, 10 pages of Blood Orange. I was about a quarter of the way through Final Girls, and I realised something. I don't like thrillers. I find them incredibly boring. And reading 2 thrillers at once, I was like, this is not the genre for me. I do not want to be here reading them. I'm going to DNF them. And I did, and I have no regrets. If you're reading a thriller and you do not care what the twist is, it's a waste of time. So I DNF'd them. I'm not planning on picking up another thriller ever again, and I feel great about it. So I'm going to just skip ahead because the next 2 books have something in common that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to skip ahead to the last book on the list, which is Way of Kings, and I DNF'd that maybe 100 pages from the end of part 1. I was doing this as a buddy read with my best friend, and whilst I hear that Brandon Sanderson is amazing, and whilst I hear that this book series, once it gets going, is like one of the best fantasies of all time, I don't have time for that. It's time for some unpopular opinions. I don't think this is a very good book. I don't think this is a well-written book. If I have read nearly 600-700 pages and the plot hasn't kicked in, that's not good writing. I'm sorry. Come for me if you must, but I'm right. That's not good writing. If I'm fighting through 600 pages of text, knowing that I've got to fight through another 600 pages of text before I get anywhere, I am too old for that shit. Like, that is not gonna happen. Anyone wants to like convert this book into a graphic novel or like a TV adaptation, great, I will watch that, I will read that, that will be a good time for me. But no, 600 pages of world building, we ain't doing it. We don't have time for that. Another thing is this book is low-key racist. I don't hear anybody talk about it. I'm assuming it gets addressed in later books, but like, uncomfortable. I don't need white men to be talking to me about racism. Uncomfortable. So yeah, not reading that, probably never pick up another Brandon Sanderson book again. It's just how I feel. I'm allowed to have my feelings. So the next book I'm going to talk about is Library of the Unwritten, and this was a book that I DNF'd, not even because it was bad, not even because it wasn't enjoyable, not even because I wasn't gripped, because it was weird. It was not what I was expecting. This book I read in October and I picked it up to be like a spooky, dark, atmospheric read. I know it's about a library in hell. I think I just read Piranesi and I thought it was going to kind of be similar vibes to that, and it wasn't. This was a very like light read. Does that make sense? It was humorous, it was kind of silly, it was fun, and that just was not what I was expecting. And it was so jarring that I was like, this is weird, I can't connect, no. So I decided that I was going to DNF it because I didn't want to force myself to read it and then end up rating it lowly because it wasn't what I was expecting. That didn't feel fair to the book, especially as it felt like a book I could really enjoy if I read it when I was in the right mind frame for it. A lot of the books on this list I have unhauled, but this is one that I still own and I still plan on reading at some point, hopefully in 2021. And so the last book that we're going to talk about is a book that I technically haven't DNF'd. As far as I'm concerned, I am still reading this book, but I have been reading it since August. So I'm in my 5th month of reading this book. I have nearly been reading this book for half a year. And that book is The Drowning Deep. This is a dark mermaid horror. It's very rooted in science. It's enjoyable, it's queer, I love it. I don't know why I haven't finished it. Can you see her tail? How can I point to it? This is my dyspraxia coming through now. How can I point there? I read this book during the great reading slump of 2020, where it was so hard to pick anything up. And the fact that I nearly finished this book is to my credit. It shows my dedication. I have about 100 pages left of this. If I can just find that little bit of motivation, I can finish this in one sitting. I just don't have that motivation. And I don't know why, because I like it. I need someone to like sit me down, put the book in my hands and say finish it, because I want to read it. I like it. I'm gonna read it. I will finish this book. This book will not be on the DNF list of 2021. This book's gonna be in a wrap up before you know it. So these are all of the books that I DNF'd in 2020, at least all of the ones that I remember. In 2021, I don't hope to DNF less books, because if I need to DNF, I'm gonna DNF. But I'm hoping that I'm gonna be able to discern more between books that I am going to love and books that I don't really have an interest in, and therefore my DNF list will be smaller. I also aim to make sure I record every book so that I know what I'm DNFing and why. And based on that, I will therefore be able to reduce my DNFs to like 0, because I'll understand myself as a reader so well that every book I pick up will be 5 stars. It's gonna happen. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching this video. Please leave me your favourite love heart emoji in the comments down below. Also let me know if you are a DNFer or if you are a not DNFer, a reader of merit. Please don't forget to like this video, and if you want to see more from me, subscribe, and hopefully you will come back and see me in another video soon. Bye!